Good afternoon, everyone. We can see that the guest today, Michael Regan, and the topic today, climate change, is of huge interest in Sciences Po, and it's no surprise. First, let me welcome Michael Regan, administrator of the Environment Protection Agency in the United States. Welcome to your home. Let me also thank you. We've been discussing a lot about COVID lately. Then came conflict, the second C. But what we need now is to focus on the first C that we should have never forgotten, which is the one about climate change. Climate change, how we deal with it, how we ensure life on this planet for future generations, and how can we decarbonize, making sure that we do this in a fair manner, that we do this with justice. This is what our speaker will bring us today. Thank you again for joining us, and let me now leave you in the good hands of Shiv. Shiv has just stepped down as the chair of the director of the chair on sustainable development at Sciences Po, but he remains firmly committed to this institution and also to this topic. So without further ado, Shiv, floor back to you.
Thank you, Dean Gonzalez. Thank you for the warm words, and welcome, Michael Regan. It's a pleasure to have you here in front of our really super bright global audience, who I'm sure are going to pepper you with all kinds of questions. So a quick introduction. Now, in this day and age of Wikipedias and the internet, this is a difficult one, because always it'll be people who have done a thorough review of who Mr. Regan is. But here, let me give it a try. As you all know, Michael S. Regan leads the US Environmental Protection Agency, which has a mission to protect human and environmental health. He's been at the job for just over a year now. He oversees EPA's implementation of regulations concerning environmental law as enacted by Congress, as enacted by the US Congress, and is helping reverse many of the steps taken by the previous administration to dismantle major US environmental regulations. So that's a lot of kind of first initial work. Previously, Mr. Regan was head of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality and won a lot of plaudits for establishing several things. One is the Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board. Second, for achieving largest coal ash cleanup settlement in the US American history. And for ordering chemical company, the Chemours Company, which is a spin-off from DuPont, to renew cleanup of what's called Gen X, which is a precursor of Teflon, from the Cape Fear River. Mr. Regan served previously with the EPA, both with the Clinton and Bush Jr. administrations. As a graduate of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Mr. Regan is the first EPA administrator from a historically black college and university. He has a master's degree from GW in public administration, that's George Washington University, and this, I believe, is his first visit to Sciences Po, and Dean Gonzalez and I are hoping will be the first of many, many visits. As you can all imagine, this past year has been a busy one for Administrator Regan and for his fine staff at the EPA. Efforts to tackle climate change receive wide media attention, such as the action on hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, new greenhouse gas emission standards for cars and light trucks that are now making a lot of the media sit up, new protections to reduce pollution from oil and natural gas industry, and of course the new climate change adaptation plan. There have been several other advancements that receive less media attention, but are in fact as noteworthy. And here what I want to really focus on is your attention is advancing environmental justice. Not an easy task, given the structurally embedded nature of racism and the politics of negativity currently we are kind of seeing all over the world. As an immigrant and academic in the US for the last 35 years, I have watched with growing dismay the many opportunities we have missed to advance truly inclusive sustainable development. For too many people, sustainable development just means green. That's a big mistake. Sustainable development is inclusive of green as well as kind of socially inclusive and green. And I hope we hear of the challenges and opportunities that Mr. Regan and the EPA face, and of his bold plans to advance environmental justice across the US. It would enormously help our students as they grapple with the very same issues in Europe and around the world. So welcome, Mr. Regan, for your remarks. It will be followed by a Q&A chaired by Professor Torre-Schaub. I thank the US Embassy in France, particularly Ms. Elizabeth Martin-Shukran, the cultural counselor at the embassy, for making this event happen. Administrator Regan, the audience is all yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here. This is absolutely going to be the highlight of my trip here in Paris this week. And I have to say that I probably shouldn't say this aloud, but it is so great to see so many young people in the crowd. I spend a lot of time with older people, and it's not quite as fun. I think that's okay to say. You know, throughout history, young people have always been at the forefront of the biggest change that this world has seen. The very first Earth Day, which we're going to celebrate next month, was led by students and grassroots activists who envisioned a healthier world where all of us could equally thrive. Today is no different. All over the world, people of your generation are fighting for a healthier, more just tomorrow. And nowhere is that more evident than right now in Ukraine, where millions of young people are standing up against the unjust and unprovoked war, a war that has created millions of refugees, that has stolen untold innocent lives, and that has tried to uproot the very foundation of democracy. But as President Biden has said, liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are forces that are far more powerful than fear and oppression. And in a contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail every time. President Biden has been clear that in the United States, we stand firmly with the people of Ukraine. We're heeding President Zelensky's call to help defend Ukraine and fight Russian aggression by supplying the Ukrainian people with arms, equipment, and security assistance to fight for the country that they love and for the future that they deserve. I'm in Paris this week to co-chair a meeting at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an institution rooted in unity and democracy, and whose history dates back to the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. This convening comes at a very critical moment. We know that there will be a long road ahead for the people of Ukraine, and we will continue to support the Ukrainian people. When the time comes, the United States Environmental Protection Agency will help to rebuild the country's environmental infrastructure just as we did the Soviet bloc nations over 30 years ago after the fall of the Soviet Union. The fight to preserve democracy is undeniably bound to the fight for a livable planet. We cannot have one without the other. Democracy is about respecting what U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called the essential human freedoms. Against the backdrop of World War II and America's looming involvement, FDR delivered what became known as his Four Freedoms speech, in which he described four basic rights that should belong to all people everywhere: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom from want includes the right to live in a healthy environment and to live without risk of environmental hazard or harm. I know that many of you here today are fighting for this exact principle. You're fighting to ensure that you and your children and their children inherit a livable planet, one that is safer, one that is healthier, one that is more equitable than the one we find ourselves with today. Because of your activism and your curiosity, you've sparked a global conversation not only about the urgency of climate change, but about the kind of world we fundamentally want to create and leave future generations to come. You've used your moral authority to grab the attention of leaders all over the world, to speak truth to power, and to demand swift action. And above all, you all understand best that our most vulnerable and underserved communities unjustly bear the burden of the climate crisis and other pressing environmental concerns. You recognize that a truly free, democratic society must prioritize and protect those voices who have long gone unheard. I've been doing this work for some time now. I've spent my entire career in the environmental field. I've never heard anyone speak with the level of conviction, clarity of thought, and sense of purpose than our young people speak with today. I am so proud of all that you have done already. And if it's not clear enough, I want to let you know that we're listening, and we will not let you down. I want you all to always remember how vital your role is in creating and demanding a better world. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we need you. We need every single one of you, and we need you for the long haul. We're here today having these conversations because of you. I am so inspired and energized by the young people that I've had the privilege to meet in my time as EP administrator. And I want to take steps to ensure that we continue to engage the youth on climate change and environmental justice. These issues are far too important to leave anyone out of the conversation. We need an all hands on deck approach. So I'm excited to announce my intent to form a United States Youth Climate and Environmental Justice Council this year. I'm asking my staff to assess the next steps to form this council so that I can personally engage regularly with the leaders of tomorrow, young, creative minds just like yours. We need your courage, and we need your compassion, your sense of justice, and your ambition. We have to get this right, and the voices of young people will be important to ensure that we get it done right. There's no doubt that the actions we take today as a global society will have lasting consequences for the next generation, including my 8-year-old son, Matthew, whose future I think about every single minute. I will never let up on my commitment to him, and I'll never let up on my commitment to all of you. So thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to engagement.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We are really genuinely and sincerely very honored and very happy to have you here today. Thank you to the organizers of this very exciting event. I think this is a great opportunity for all us, and especially for students and the youth. So maybe just a couple of questions to start, and I will give the floor to the students maybe. So may I ask you just two very small questions, sir?
Yes, as long as they're easy.
Okay, so here it is. I'm very interested on the path that the EPA will take, and the steps that will be given in the future, the next future, middle, and future, about this coming back to the Paris Agreement. Maybe because we are in Paris and because it's an international issue, and I'm particularly interested in this kind of questions. So I think that in the executive order that was published last year in January about tackling climate change, there was this particular wish to cooperate in the international field on climate change issues. So can you maybe tell us a little more about that?
Absolutely, and I can first and foremost say that the United States should have never left. And one of the best experiences I've had in my professional career was traveling internationally after the president announced that the United States would rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. And the overwhelming response to America being back was just really superb. The president has made a commitment that we're going to double down and try to make up for that lost time. He's pledged scientific integrity. He's pledged a commitment to reduce climate change pollution. And he's pledged that we will do it in a transparent and engaging way. Many of you may be watching this play out politically. The president is providing leadership and engaging on the political stage in terms of Congress on getting additional resources and language to push and drive down carbon emissions. But at the same time, he tasked me from day one to use all of the powers that are invested in me or vested in me to begin to reduce climate pollution from day one. And so we've jumped in immediately, tackling HFCs, as was mentioned earlier, 85% reduction of HFCs in 15 years. We proposed the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction from light-duty vehicles and cars and trucks through model year 2027. We're already working on another rule to focus on vehicles from 2027 and beyond. Under President Biden's watch, we will usher in electric vehicles, and we will begin to sunset the internal combustion engine. We have proposed the most aggressive regulation to control methane emissions from existing and new oil and gas facilities. And we are now focused on going after those reductions that we can achieve from power plants as well. So the president has a lot of tools in his toolbox. And while he continues to negotiate with Congress to expedite the utilization of market forces and expediting investments for finance and technology, will continue to be a complement to what he's pursuing politically by using our regulatory authority. The time is now. There's a fierce sense of urgency that we all feel. And so the president has pledged leadership, and that's what we plan to deliver.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think you kind of answered to my second question. So I think I will pass the floor then to the public, to the students that are really very keen to have a conversation with you. May I ask you, before you ask your questions, to very briefly decline your nationality and the program that you are following at Sciences Po, please? And if you need, of course, translation, we will provide it. I think there is a micro somewhere there, or maybe in the room.
You may stand up and come to this mic here to ask your question.
Sorry for that.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, so my name is Clarisse. I'm a French black girl, and I am a second-year student at Sciences Po. I just wanted to ask do you think that veganism is a way to reduce our greenhouse emissions? And because we know that black people are most likely to have to be lactose intolerant, and do you think that we should make some biggest action to prevent this gas emission, and also about being black and vegan, I mean, and just being black and trying to reduce our natural or our greenhouse emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I believe that this climate crisis requires an all hands on deck, and I believe that we all can take personal accountability in how we live our lives. The question that you posed sounds like that there could be both climate and health benefits, and obviously we want to encourage a healthy planet and healthy people. I think that whether it's veganism or whether it's energy efficiency or personally you know, looking at how we preserve our use or utilization of water, we should look at all of these practices. But I will say that while I believe all of us can be personally accountable, we cannot let corporations off the hook. The biggest greenhouse gas emissions are coming from more than just individuals. They're coming from institutions, organizations, corporations that spew these toxic pollutants out into the air. These emissions are not only potent for our planet, but they're also potent for our persons as well. And in the United States, as we take a look at that, we're also looking at the fact that many of these facilities are concentrated in communities of color. You know, because of redlining, systemic racism, rezoning, there are lots of reasons why we are seeing black, brown, indigenous people being targeted and dumped on as it relates to health-based pollutants. And then we also know that our black, brown, and indigenous communities, as well as our low-income communities, are the ones that are most susceptible to these climate change impacts. And so my advocacy is such that we should all do things that will make us personally healthier while doing our part to protect the planet. But you know, we also have to hold those accountable who have been polluting this planet and our communities for far too long.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. This is how environmental justice is about. This is really the essence. Thank you. It's quite unique in the United States, this kind of program, I will say, because in Europe we are a little far from that, but maybe we will come back to that later in the discussion. So next question, please.
Yes, hello. Yeah, so I'm Simon. I'm from Belgium and an environmental policy student, and I had a bit of a question regarding a bit more the political side of also this transition and the fact that you also, that we all know that the US then, under the Trump administration, retrieved from the Paris Agreement, and now through Biden aims to get back into it. And I'm wondering how can the EPA, or how can you ensure kind of discontinuity in these environmental actions, and especially regards to climate change, because maybe another president in the future will again want to draw back out of the agreement. And I'm really wondering how can the EPA, or in general, ensure the continuity over time and not lose a lot of efforts and time to always reverse the regulations from the previous administration?
Well, thank you, Simon. That's an excellent question, and I'll tell you, it starts with leadership at the top. And the president has indicated that he will look at a whole of government approach, and EPA is one of the many agencies that is focused on that approach. We're also looking at the public-private partnership in order to drive the level of success that we'd like to see. The reality is that the previous administrations, the Trump administration's policies, were actually antagonistic to many of the desires of corporate America. And so what we found is, on our side, we have science, we have technology, but we have market forces and market conditions by which many of these companies want to invest and want to move forward. So we believe over the next 4 years, as the president works with Congress to really legislate and get some financial incentives to expedite this transition, we'll put the proper regulations in place. These regulations basically serve as rules of the road. Many of these corporations want some level of certainty. We're having very constructive conversations with our power sector. We're having very constructive conversations with our oil and gas sector. We're having constructive conversations because they know the market is driving in that direction. They know that there are cost-effective control technologies available. More importantly, they know that the demand is out there, whether it's private equity or insurance companies. Everyone is really taking inventory on just how dangerous some of these current practices are. Quite frankly, if we were further along in our financial investments in clean energy, we would be seeing a lot less price volatility as we go through this current conflict that we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine. So all of the signs point to it's a great economic investment, it's a great environmental investment, it's a great human investment. And I believe that over the next 4 years, we can make such strong investments and put such strong regulations in place that it will be hard to reverse that just because of political ideology.
Thank you. This is what is all the dynamics of the Paris Agreement about. So yes, private sector, public sector, working together. Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Hey, my name is Leo. I'm German-French, as you may hear. I'm doing the Environmental Policy Master, and I had a more specific question concerning the equity part that you mentioned before, especially also, as Simon mentioned, that through electorates that might be more concerned in swing states, as also that were former supporting Obama, but then also Trump, how you want to address former industrial regions, like which dialogue the EPA is engaging with people, especially concerned in the Rust Belt, when I think about that, or Detroit, which role and which part are you playing in that? Because apart from mentioning the financial incentives, those are regions that really want to be heard, and my question would be, what concretely is the measure that you're taking that people feel listened and not excluded and frustrated or left behind?
Well, thank you for that question. And you know, it really starts with just a bit of education and exposure, because we're knocking down this myth that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive. They actually go hand in hand, and they go hand in hand very well. One example we have is the crumbling water infrastructure in the United States. And whether you're in the South or the North or the Midwest, if you visit a city that still has, you know, lead service lines, and you spend time with whether it's a Republican, independent, or Democratic family, and their children are exposed to drinking lead water, well, it's a pretty easy sales pitch to make that we need to eradicate lead service lines in this country because we know that it impacts the brain development of our children. We also know that it's 30% more likely that those lead impacts are going to be in a Black, brown, or indigenous community. So one of the things that we're doing is when we look at environmental justice, we're really focusing on the disproportionate impact, but we're not losing sight of the fact that there is an impact to all people when we don't reduce these environmental hazards and harms. We are trying to depoliticize these issues. And when you look at something like water infrastructure, you know, whether it's a disproportionately impacted community or a more affluent community, we want to get the lead out of the water, but we also know that there are good paying jobs that will be required to remove those lead service lines. That's the sort of tenor we are taking when we look at environmental justice and equity. Public health is a driving factor, and when we think about some of the refineries in the Midwest or the Southeast, again, we're looking at the fact that most people do not want to see families or children disproportionately harmed. And so it's really about going into these communities, giving these communities a voice, bringing the media, and exposing all of these hazards and harms. And I believe that most people, most humans are good. And when they see these things happening, they want to take action. Just a couple of weeks ago, I visited a county in the southern part of the United States. And in this county, 35% of the population have hookworm, something that we thought we had eradicated in the United States. The reason being is because only 25% of the population in that county is hooked up to a wastewater treatment facility. Everyone else has a septic tank that's not functioning well and buried, or some people are doing what I thought was extinct, which are straight piping. They have pipes running from their toilets through the side of their homes into the very yards that their children are playing in. Those are environmental justice communities, but when you see that story on national news, there's not a decent person in the United States that wants to see that happening to anyone. So there's a way to connect these stories to everyone, and it starts through that public health lens and just making these things human. Not overly politicizing, but focusing on the science and the facts. We believe that we can take that approach with climate change, but we also believe we can take that approach with the disproportionate impact of pollution that we're seeing in so many of our communities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Jude. I'm from the United States, New Jersey specifically, so we have a very thick history of environmental policy. And first, I just want to say it's really refreshing to have an administrator with as much passion as you do for environmental justice and such a long list of accomplishments with environmental policy. As someone leading the EPA, it's super refreshing, so I just want to say thank you for being here. And my question is, what do you do to continue fighting for environmental protection in the face of growing partisanship and extremism in American politics? And how can young people like us carry over those practices into our careers in the future?
Well, I think the first thing is recognizing that we all have a responsibility. If you close your eyes to these issues, then they won't be solved. I feel a special obligation that since the president has given me this opportunity, that I need to use every waking moment to bring attention to environmental justice and inequities, but also fight for the climate change impacts that we're seeing on a daily basis. You know, you don't have to trust the scientists if you don't want to anymore. You can look out your window and you will see a wildfire, a drought, a flood, a hurricane. We're feeling it, we're experiencing it. I feel a special obligation in this day and time because it's so real to take action. And so maybe there will be consequences for moving too fast and too aggressively in terms of politics. I think that's a chance that we all have to be willing to take. I think it's a risk that we all have to be willing to take. I just firmly believe, though, that the younger generation is so educated on these issues and so passionate and so outspoken that I don't feel alone. So I believe that if we continue to push as hard as we can, I firmly know that you all will have our backs. And so this isn't, one country at a time. This is a global phenomenon. Young people are standing up and saying enough is enough. Our partisan politics are so thick that you can barely get the basics done. But I think on public health and climate is something that unites all of us. And so my attitude is probably the same as yours, which is push as hard as you can for as long as you can. And when somebody sits you down, maybe somebody else will stand up and take your place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, my name is Federico. I'm in the Environmental Policy Master as well. And I'm from Mexico and also a proudly member of Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. So my question, and to give a little bit of context, recently Mexican President López Obrador has been doing these mega projects like the Maya train and the Dos Bocas refinery, which clearly have done and will do even more environmental damage. And he recently pitched a bill to prioritize the state power utility over private firms, sparking criticism that it would undermine wind and solar power investment at a critical time for companies striving to use more clean energy. So actually, US climate envoy John Kerry urged Mexico's President Andrés Manuel to ensure his plan to boost a state control of the power market that does not breach the USMCA agreement. So he actually stated like Mexico can play a vital role, and well, López Obrador seems to have no interest at all on environment and has even dropped the National Emergency Climate Change Fund. And knowing all this and knowing that Latin America could become a huge source of climate refugees, what further efforts can USA do to lead the clear climate actions for Latin America to follow in times of rising autocracies, and when USA just stated that they would pursue further oil investments? And how can we, young people, help on this too? Thank you.
Thank you. Boy.
Yeah, it's a big question, I know, sorry.
I'll see if I can unpack that a little bit. You know, I have to say that I have enjoyed great bilateral conversations with my Mexican counterpart, who clearly has embraced the fierce urgency of combating climate change, but also looking at environmental justice and some of these water quality issues. We have a joint agenda that we're moving forward on that I'm really proud of. I think the United States has to demonstrate leadership. It's one thing for us to say it, but it's another thing for us to follow through. I believe that as we continue to demonstrate leadership and follow through, that puts the right pressure on some of our international counterparts. 80% of new capacity built in the United States this year and next year will be solar, wind, and battery storage. The reality is that the markets are so competitive and the costs are coming down that it is almost a political statement to invest in the past. What we have to do is separate the politics from good market conditions and technological availability and continue to move forward. And we know that we can't do that alone. So Special Envoy Kerry, myself, and others, we're trying to have these conversations both publicly and privately, and think of creative ways that we can leverage these public-private partnerships to drive towards that innovation and creativity that I think all of our countries want. Again, going back to sort of the reality of where we find ourselves, if we all internationally had embraced clean energy a little bit sooner, we would not see the reliance that we're seeing on fossil fuels. And the reality is that this war has hit the world very quickly, and there's a gap. And that gap is being filled by fossil fuels. What we want to be sure of is that while many countries are filling that gap with fossil fuels, we do not slow down on our investments in clean energy, because we don't want to find ourselves in this position ever again. We want to find ourselves more nationally secure, more independent, breathing cleaner air, drinking cleaner water, and being a little further along in our fierce battle against these climate change impacts. And so it's my goal to continue to keep the pedal to the metal, keep pushing as hard as possible. And if and when we find ourselves in this situation again, we'll be relying more on clean energy, not fossil fuels.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So next question.
Hello, my name is Dora. Thank you very much for your intervention. It's really interesting. I have two questions.
Okay.
I was wondering what we could do in the field of education to promote environmental protection. And then I'm also really interested in the issue of climate refugees, and I don't know if the EPA is already handling these sort of issues, and if it does, what are the EPA's positions towards climate refugees?
Well, thank you, and I am really passionate about environmental education. I like to tell this joke, and I like to use my wife as the example instead of me, but My son often walks into the bathroom and tells my wife to stop letting the water run while she brushes her teeth. And you know, the reality is that younger and younger folks are just wired to be natural environmentalists. And so if we continue to provide them the tools, the resources, and the education, it'll be so ingrained that we won't have to deal with what I like to think of as some of this backwards thinking that we're having to deal with now. So environmental education is big at EPA. Our K through 12, we have programs. We are actually, we have lots of relationships with our colleges and universities, and this year we're embarking upon a journey to create a special relationship with our historically black colleges and universities and our minority serving institutions as well. We want to do more research and development with these institutions. We also want to create a pipeline so that we can have a more diverse workforce. And quite frankly, when we think about environmental justice and equity, the EJ communities trust those university voices much more than some of the majority universities that we've been leaning on for quite some time. So there's a lot there in terms of environmental education that we're really excited to take advantage of. You know, I think that I was lucky enough recently to have a visitor stop by EPA to talk about climate refugees, and she knew a lot more about climate refugees than I ever dreamed to know. But we were talking about the types of partnerships that we can put in place, and it was Angelique Jolie, and she said that, you know, the thing that EPA can do the best is prevent the climate crisis to help reduce and mitigate against the storms. And so we're laser focused on not just adaptation, but that mitigation piece. We also understand that, to the very essence of your question, mitigating against climate change, it's so important for so many reasons. But as Angelina Jolie was talking through the refugee issue, and she was looking at it specifically through young girls and a young woman's lens and how vulnerable they are. You can think about all of the vulnerabilities of humanity when facing a climate crisis, and it just really gets my staff excited about just how bold we have to be and how responsible and accountable we are. So we are focused on the refugee angle just from a mitigation standpoint is where our role is, and I can assure you the majority of my staff, if not all, are excited to participate in getting the environmental education component up and running.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and I am American also, and from Missouri to be specific. I'm doing environmental policy here and development at LSE, and I wanted to ask a question about consumerism, as that is a huge part of US culture, and I wanted to see what you thought about how we can incite a cultural change to come away from this consumer-based culture and maybe apply policies while also making sure that these policies do not put underserved communities in bad situations. So thank you.
Wow, that's a heavy one. You know, I think from EPA's vantage point there on the consumer side, it's really education. And I think that if we can focus on educating our constituency on the products that they're purchasing and the impacts that they have on the environment, it's that behavioral shift that we believe we can have the most impact. Sort of like about 30 years ago, we created the Energy Star label. Most people think that's the Department of Energy, but EPA actually created the Energy Star label. And that was a way to drive consumer behavior. And now, when you look at most appliances, if not all, they strive to have that Energy Star label, and most people want that product to have that label. We believe that we can apply sort of those market incentives for behavioral change throughout the supply chain. I know that when we think about these forever chemicals like PFAS, we really wanted to educate society on the fact that these forever chemicals are in everyday products, whether it's Teflon, Gore-Tex, or the like. And so I think that will also drive what people purchase and how they make their decisions. The more educated we all are, the better off we all are. And so I think the consumer-driven lens in terms of our equities is from a reduction of a carbon footprint standpoint, but it's also from a public health standpoint because we have a lot of harmful chemicals and a lot of products that we consume each and every day.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is all about information and the right to information. This is also a very important component of environmental justice. Absolutely. Next question.
Hi, my name is Claire. I'm from New York, and I wanted to ask a question about the recent Supreme Court case brought by West Virginia against the EPA on the various iterations of the Clean Power Plan. I know you don't have the results of the case, but in the case that the Supreme Court rules against the EPA, what options would that leave the agency for reducing emissions from the power sector?
We are watching that case very, very closely. And of course, that case is really focused on EPA's authority to directly reduce or control greenhouse gas emissions. And we're hoping that if there is a ruling that is not in our favor, that it will just, be an incremental step and not completely undermine what we believe Massachusetts versus EPA actually demonstrated. So I believe that my hope is that we will retain some of our regulatory authority to control greenhouse gas emissions. But I also said at a big power sector convention not too long ago that EPA has a number of tools in its toolbox. And what we're actually doing is taking a look at all of our existing regulatory authority for some of the more traditional pollutants like hazardous air pollutants, mercury, and other toxins, PM and NOx, our health-based pollutants, how we regulate the disposal of coal ash, and how we regulate our water effluent guidelines to ensure that we're not polluting our waterways. If we present a suite of those regulations to the power sector at one time and not darken their doorstep one at a time, they can look at the types of investments that they would have to make to meet all of those standards. We believe, as they've told us, that if they're faced with that type of investment decision, that it's more economical and advantageous for them to not invest in the traditional fossil fuel types of infrastructure, but clean energy sources. So we believe that we can use our health-based programs as well as our greenhouse gas rule to drive the power sector in the direction that we believe it should be going, which is investing in cleaner energy.
Thank you. We can just, I'm so sorry, but we can just take 3 very short more questions. Thank you for your understanding.
Hi, I'm Nora. I'm Canadian and Algerian, and I'm studying international public management. Thank you for being here. So my question, we've talked a bit about it, but extreme polarization on climate change and environmental policies is quite recent. In the US, Republican Theodore Roosevelt established national parks, whereas Democrat FDR established the National Soil Conservation Service. And of course, Nixon played a key role in founding the Environmental Protection Agency. So I'm wondering, how do you explain this extreme polarization that has risen in the US? And also, a few questions touched on that, but how do we make climate change a human concern rather than a political one? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And it is a human concern. And I think we have to talk about it in very human terms. I believe that there's vernacular that we can all choose to use that can bring more people into the circle. There are politics that people subscribe to while the cameras are on, and there are politics that people subscribe to when the cameras are off. And I can say that there are a lot more Republicans who believe in the science, who believe in the facts, but would love to lean into the conversation using markets and technology and cost, and be a little lighter on the science and the people side. I think that there are a lot of people that believe as I do, which is, humanity is driving this conversation, and we want to believe and lean in on the science and the impacts to humanity. We have to figure out how we bridge that gap. the reality is that we can't force everyone to think the same way we think. So what is the quickest path for all of us to get on the same page? How do we bring people to the table and use a conversation that doesn't sacrifice the principles and continues to drive that fierce sense of urgency? And by the way, I believe that you can drive that conversation through job growth, economic development, advancing technologies, and global economies while saving the planet and protecting people. You don't have to split any of those up, and I think we have to talk about it in a much more holistic way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just two more questions, please.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. My name's Chloe. I'm in my second year of Master's in Environmental Policy, and I grew up in South Carolina. And my question is more on the issue of plastic pollution. Even when plastic does go in the right bins, they're very rarely recycled, be it in the US, Canada, anywhere in Europe. And even in the case where they do get recycled, some recycling projects, especially advanced recycling like chemical recycling, they don't always work. Sometimes it's just incineration. When they do get landfilled, it's terrible for the environment. When it is incineration, greenhouse gas emissions. So my question is, do you have any plans for supporting recycling projects, specifically what the EU has put in place, like mandatory recycled content targets, extended producer responsibility schemes, thing like that? Like, my question is, how do we make waste valuable in order to promote investments in that sector? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm from North Carolina, so I'm from the other Carolina. You know, I can tell you that second to climate change, plastics is the #1 topic that young people raise when they come into the office. And we have woefully underinvested in looking at creating an infrastructure in this country that can handle plastics, hold companies accountable, but also provide those market-based incentives for secondary and tertiary uses of plastic. One of the things that we are committed to doing at EPA is focusing on how we can shore up our regulatory regime so that we can focus more on plastics. And as part of our international dialogues, we've been partnering with lots of countries to think about how we get arm in arm on reducing plastic exposure, and thinking about creating those markets so that we can find other uses for plastics that have already been created. It's an area that we are not nearly far enough along in, but I can assure you, if you all keep banging on our door, we'll finally figure it out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the last question, good luck. And anyway, I try to be short. The point is how to do things. So, first point, which is the political strategy of this administration to convince the Congress to vote the ambition plan? For example, about how we can convince like the Democratic congressmen that live in states where that depends on coal, because we know that 18% of energy mix in US still is coal, for example, and how can you do physically? And other point is that in the US, it seems that the idea is that market and technology will push to renewables and to fight climate change. But I think that is interesting also, maybe the more European point of view, that without a strong involvement of the state, it's impossible to push, not impossible, but it's quite difficult to push the industry and the people. And I think that this is another point of view. I see every time that I read something, also American books, and this point of view of US that anyway we'll go there. But actually, we also it's not only a market point. It's also a public opinion point, because the states in US that are suffering and will suffer more from climate change are the same one that vote for Republicans. So also people that see fireworks will not vote for people that push climate justice. So I want to know which is the strategy and the idea to deal with this problem. Maybe it's not a short question, sorry, but anyway, I'm with Tommaso and Erasmus here, so just to present myself.
Thank you.
What a way to get your foot in the door. Sell it as a short question and then go for it. So the president recognized this early on and convened a number of agencies to focus on what we're calling coal transition states. And the reality is that there are a number of states that have been providing coal as a resource and it spurred the Industrial Revolution. Those communities will need help transitioning in terms of retooling their skill sets, new economic opportunities to replace the old ones, and really just transitioning those communities. I think having an effective communication plan that, number one, if you come from a generation of coal miners, that there is no reason to demonize your family's history or a trade that once fueled the American economy. The reality is that as technologies evolve, there's yet less utilization of that fuel. We have to think about how we transition those communities and those states. Many of those communities and states, their tax base, their school systems, their healthcare systems, they're built on the revenue streams from coal. So there needs to be an economic replacement spurred, and that's something that the Biden-Harris administration has really focused on. If we can do a better job of that, then we see a lot less resistance in some of those communities. To your point, we cannot go as far and as fast as we'd like without our states. And we know our states are in different places, but as we engage with our private sector, our corporate partners, many of these companies are multi-state, multinational companies. They are being forced to follow the economics, the science, the technology, and the market pool. So they are spending some capital themselves trying to help curry some political favor to get some movement in the directions that we need. It's an all-hands-on-deck approach. What we're talking about here, in addition to a market and technological shift, in addition to an economic shift, we're talking about a cultural shift for many of our communities. And so I think we want to be very sensitive to those who are on that cultural shift spectrum. At the same time, while we're looking at replacing some of these fossil fuels, I think it's important to learn from the mistakes of the past. And that's where environmental justice and equity comes in. Environmental justice is really focused on those past transgressions, those communities that have been disproportionately impacted by certain investments. But as we think about the future, that's where we have to apply this equity lens. And I believe, and the president believes, that if we do it through an environmental justice and equity lens, we can create a rising tide that lifts all boats. And we believe that if America is going to be as great as the country is designed to be, we cannot leave the least amongst us behind.
Thank you. One last question, please.
Well,
My name is Eyal, and I really like how you talk about the power of young people and talk truth to power. In this line of reasoning, I want to ask, how do you say that this climate crisis is the most urgent crisis in our lifetime when Biden administration didn't treat it this way? I mean, the administration has spent 18 times more on military than on climate in 2023 budget. Moreover, the administration hasn't stopped fracking and even didn't decrease the use of fossil fuels. So with this fact, how can we believe you that you say that this is the most urgent crisis in our lifetime?
Well, number one, I think that our actions speak just as loud as our words. And when we think about fracking, when we think about the oil and gas sector, again, we propose the most aggressive, most stringent methane reduction from this industry that our country has ever seen. I think the investments in clean energy, the regulations, the transportation sector is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. When you look at our regulations on light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles, you will see that it's the most aggressive. These are the most aggressive regulations that you've seen in terms of combating climate pollutants. At the same time, we're capturing the co-benefits of those same emissions that exacerbate asthma and other respiratory illnesses that we're seeing impact society. I would argue that the president has really taken a very bold approach to looking at combating climate change, especially dealing with and wrestling with the politics that he is wrestling with. He's pushing the country as quickly as possible. I think many of the questions that were posed preceding yours outline some of the difficulties that we have as a country. To say that we are where we should be, the answer is no. To say that the president is pushing very hard and we
we desire to be further along, and that's what his leadership represents? I would say absolutely yes. And I would say that the president is very proud of the amount of resources that he is able to provide to the Ukrainian people during this very serious time of conflict. So I think the president is doing a really strong job, a good job, in terms of balancing both our domestic and our international equities as it relates to war, climate change, and being globally competitive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. So thank you, sir, for all your responses, and thank you to the students and all the public for those so enriching questions. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. So I think we all are very conscious that we are all the humanity to the same destiny, and that we have to take care to our planet. We are in an emergency time, but we are also in a transition time. Thank you so much for telling us what will be the pathway.
Thank you so much. That was really great.
I'm really happy to
A lot of good questions.
chance to meet you. I'm a former Fulbright, so I had part of